My fiancé laughed while his mom called me a gold digger at Thanksgiving, so I handed back the ring and walked out without a word. I'm 26, and until 3 weeks ago I thought I was living in a fairy tale. My fiancé Blake and I had been together for 2 years and engaged for 6 months. He's a successful software engineer at a major tech company making good money, and I'm a kindergarten teacher who absolutely loves working with kids. We seemed like the perfect match, supportive of each other's careers and genuinely excited about building a life together. Blake proposed last spring during a weekend trip to the mountains. It was everything I dreamed of, romantic and thoughtful, with a beautiful vintage ring that had belonged to his grandmother. He said he'd been saving up for months to buy it from his aunt who'd inherited it, and that he wanted me to have something with family history. I was so touched that he'd put that much thought and meaning into the proposal. His family seemed to like me well enough during our first year of dating. His mom, Susan, was polite but distant, which I attributed to her being protective of her only son. His dad, Robert, was friendlier and would ask about my students and teaching methods whenever we visited. Blake's younger sister, Kelly, was sweet and often asked for advice about college and career choices. Everything seemed normal for a new relationship. But things started changing after Blake and I moved in together last winter. Susan began making little comments about how expensive rent was in our area and whether I was contributing my fair share to household expenses. When Blake mentioned we were looking at houses, she immediately started talking about down payments and mortgage qualifications, like she was worried I wouldn't be able to carry my weight financially. I make decent money as a teacher, but nothing compared to Blake's tech salary. He'd always insisted that we split everything proportionally based on our incomes, which seemed fair and reasonable to both of us. He paid about 70% of our shared expenses, while I covered 30%, plus I handled most of the cooking and household management since he worked longer hours. The comments from Susan got more pointed after our engagement. She'd make remarks about wedding costs and whether we'd registered for expensive gifts. She seemed obsessed with money in a way that made me uncomfortable, but Blake would just shrug it off, saying his mom had always been practical about finances. He said it came from growing up middle class and having to work hard for everything they had. What bothered me most was that Blake never defended me when his mom made these comments. He'd change the subject or make some joke to deflect, but he never actually told her to stop questioning my financial contributions or treating me like I was taking advantage of him. I started to feel like he agreed with her concerns, but didn't want to say so directly. The engagement ring became a particular source of tension with Susan. She'd make comments about how it was a family heirloom and how important it was to their heritage. She'd tell stories about Blake's grandmother and great-grandmother who'd worn it, emphasizing how it had always stayed within the family bloodline. The subtext was always clear that I was an outsider who didn't really deserve to wear something so precious. Blake and I had started planning our wedding for next fall, and I was excited about all the details. We'd booked a venue, found a photographer, and I'd even found my dress. But every conversation about wedding plans seemed to involve Susan questioning the costs or suggesting we scale back to something more affordable. She kept saying things like, "You don't want to start your marriage in debt," while looking directly at me. I tried talking to Blake about his mother's behavior, but he always minimized it. He'd say she was just being cautious because she cared about our future together. He claimed she'd acted the same way when Kelly had gotten serious with her boyfriend and that it wasn't personal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Susan saw me as a threat to her son's financial security. The final straw leading up to Thanksgiving was when Susan suggested we have a prenuptial agreement. She brought it up during a family dinner, saying it was just good sense for any couple with different earning potentials. She framed it as protecting both of us, but the way she looked at me made it clear she thought I was the one who needed to be protected against. Blake seemed embarrassed by his mother's suggestion, but he didn't shut it down completely. He said we could discuss it privately and that maybe it wasn't a bad idea to have everything clear from the start. That conversation haunted me for weeks because it felt like he was starting to see me the way his mother did, as someone who might take advantage of his success. I started dreading family gatherings because I knew Susan would find new ways to make me feel unwelcome. But I loved Blake, and I thought we could work through these issues once we were married and had some distance from his family's influence. I convinced myself that Susan would eventually accept me and that Blake would learn to stand up for our relationship. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored. The way Blake would go quiet when his mom criticized me. How he'd nod along when she talked about financial responsibility and protecting family assets. The way he'd never once told his mother that her comments about me were inappropriate or hurtful. I was so focused on the fantasy of our perfect relationship that I missed the reality of what was actually happening. Thanksgiving was supposed to be our chance to announce our wedding date and share our excitement with the whole family. I'd brought homemade dinner rolls and a special dessert recipe I'd learned from my grandmother. I was nervous, but hopeful that maybe this would be the day Susan finally started accepting me as part of the family. I couldn't have been more wrong about what was coming. The drive to Blake's parents' house took about an hour, and I spent most of it talking excitedly about our wedding plans. Blake seemed distracted and kept checking his phone, but I assumed he was just nervous about announcing our date to his family. We'd decided to tell them we'd chosen October 15th for the ceremony and that we'd already put down deposits on the venue and photographer. Susan answered the door wearing an apron and a tight smile. She hugged Blake warmly, but gave me a brief side hug that felt more like a polite obligation than genuine affection. She complimented the rolls I'd brought, but in a way that sounded surprised, like she hadn't expected me to contribute anything worthwhile to the meal. The house smelled amazing with turkey and all the traditional sides cooking in the kitchen. Robert was watching football in the living room and Kelly was setting the dining room table with their good china. Everything looked picture perfect, like a scene from a magazine about family holidays. I tried to relax and enjoy the festive atmosphere. During the pre-dinner socializing, Susan kept making little digs about wedding expenses and how much everything costs these days. She'd mention friends whose children had spent ridiculous amounts on their weddings and how those marriages had ended in divorce. Blake would laugh nervously and change the subject, but he never told his mother to stop bringing up money every 5 minutes. When we sat down for dinner, Susan insisted I sit next to her, which should have been my first warning that something was planned. She started the meal by saying how grateful she was to have her family together and how important it was to protect the people you love. The way she emphasized protect while looking at me made my stomach clench with anxiety. Blake cleared his throat and announced that we'd set our wedding date for October 15th. Kelly squealed with excitement and Robert raised his glass in a toast. But Susan's reaction was immediate and cold. She asked how we planned to pay for everything and whether we'd thought about the long-term financial implications of starting married life with wedding debt. I tried to explain that we'd been saving carefully and that my parents were contributing to the costs, but Susan cut me off. She said it was sweet that my family wanted to help, but that Blake had worked so hard to build his career and savings. She emphasized how important it was for him to make smart financial decisions, especially when choosing a life partner. The conversation got increasingly uncomfortable as Susan questioned every aspect of our wedding plans. She wanted to know exact costs for the venue, the photographer, and even my dress. When Blake mentioned we were planning a honeymoon to Europe, she actually gasped and said that was an enormous expense for someone in my profession to take on. That's when I realized what was happening. Susan wasn't just being cautious about wedding expenses, she was systematically building a case that I was financially irresponsible and that Blake was making a mistake by marrying someone who couldn't contribute equally to their future. Every question was designed to highlight the gap between our incomes and suggest I was taking advantage. Blake sat there through all of this looking increasingly uncomfortable, but still not defending me. When his mother asked pointed questions about my student loan debt and whether I'd be able to help with a house down payment, he actually nodded along like these were reasonable concerns. I felt completely alone sitting at that table surrounded by people who were supposed to become my family. The breaking point came during dessert when Susan started talking about family traditions and protecting family assets. She mentioned the engagement ring again and how it represented generations of family history. Then she looked directly at me and said, "I just hope Blake has chosen someone who values our family for the right reasons and not just for what she can get out of it." Blake laughed. Not a nervous, uncomfortable laugh, but an actual amused chuckle like his mother had made a clever joke. He said, "Mom, you're being dramatic," but his tone was affectionate, not defensive. He was treating her accusation that I was a gold digger like it was harmless family teasing instead of a devastating insult to the woman he claimed to love. Susan wasn't done though. She continued, saying, "I've seen too many young men taken advantage of by women who are more interested in financial security than genuine love. Blake has worked so hard for everything he has, and I'd hate to see someone take advantage of his generous nature." The entire table went silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. Susan had just called me a gold digger in front of the whole family, and Blake was still sitting there with that stupid smile on his face like nothing had happened. Kelly looked mortified and Robert was staring at his plate, but nobody said anything to contradict Susan's assessment. I waited for Blake to say something, anything to defend me or tell his mother she was completely out of line. But he just took another bite of pie and said, "Can we maybe talk about something else?" Like his mother's attack on my character was just an awkward conversation topic to move past rather than a fundamental assault on our relationship. That's when I understood with crystal clarity that Blake agreed with his mother. He might not have had the courage to say it himself, but his failure to defend me spoke volumes about what he really thought. In his mind, I was indeed someone who was marrying him for financial security rather than love, and his mother was just voicing concerns he'd been too polite to express directly. I sat at that dining room table for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Susan had called me a gold digger, Blake had laughed, and now everyone was acting like we should just move on to discussing football or holiday shopping plans. The casual cruelty of it was almost more shocking than the accusation itself. My hands were shaking as I reached for my water glass, and I could feel tears starting to form behind my eyes. But I refused to give Susan the satisfaction of seeing me cry or break down in front of her family. Instead, I excused myself to use the bathroom where I could think clearly about what I needed to do next. Standing in that bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror, I realized I was looking at a woman who'd been lying to herself for months. All those little comments from Susan, all those times Blake had failed to defend me, all the conversations about prenups and financial responsibility suddenly made perfect sense. They'd never seen me as Blake's equal partner, they'd seen me as a liability. The engagement ring felt heavy on my finger as I twisted it around, thinking about everything it represented. Blake had said it symbolized his love and commitment to our future together, but now I understood it was more like a test. His family was watching to see if I was worthy of their precious heirloom, or if I was just another gold digger trying to marry into money. I thought about all the times I'd defended Blake when my friends questioned whether his family really accepted me. I'd made excuses for Susan's behavior and convinced myself that she just needed time to warm up to me. I'd told myself that Blake's failure to stand up for me was just conflict avoidance, not agreement with his mother's assessment of my character. But sitting there at Thanksgiving dinner watching him laugh while his mother systematically destroyed my reputation had shown me the truth. Blake didn't see me as his equal partner, he saw me as someone beneath his social and economic status who should be grateful for his attention. His mother's cruelty was just saying out loud what he'd been thinking all along. I realized I had two choices. I could go back to that table and try to defend myself, explain that I genuinely loved Blake for who he was, not what he could provide, and hope that somehow I could change their minds about my character. Or I could accept that this family would never respect me and that Blake had already chosen his mother's opinion over my dignity. The decision was actually easier than I'd expected. I couldn't marry someone who would sit quietly while his mother attacked my character and motivations. I couldn't build a life with someone who fundamentally questioned whether I was with him for love or money. And I definitely couldn't become part of a family that saw me as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed. I took off the engagement ring and held it in my palm, looking at the antique setting that had belonged to Blake's grandmother. Susan was right about one thing: it did belong with their family bloodline. It deserved to be worn by someone they respected and valued, not someone they saw as a gold-digging outsider trying to steal their precious son's money. Walking back to that dining room was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but also one of the most empowering. I'd finally stopped making excuses for people who didn't respect me and decided to choose my own dignity over a relationship that was slowly destroying my self-worth. Blake and his family were about to learn that some things can't be bought or taken for granted. I paused at the dining room doorway and took one last look at the scene. Blake was laughing at something Robert had said, while Susan cleared dessert plates with a satisfied expression on her face. Kelly was scrolling through her phone, probably texting friends about the drama she'd just witnessed. None of them seemed particularly concerned about how their behavior had affected me. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that I was making the right choice. A family that truly cared about Blake's happiness would have been horrified by Susan's behavior, not amused by it. A man who truly loved me would have been furious at his mother's disrespect, not laughing along with her cruelty. I deserved so much better than this, and I was finally ready to demand it. I walked back into the dining room and stood beside my chair for a moment, watching Blake finish his pie while chatting casually with his father about work. The normalcy of the scene after what had just happened felt surreal, like I was watching actors perform a play about family dysfunction. Susan looked up at me with that same tight smile she'd been wearing all day, clearly expecting me to sit back down and pretend everything was fine. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the engagement ring. The sight of it in my hand immediately caught Blake's attention, and his fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The casual conversation around the table died as everyone realized something significant was happening. Susan's smile faltered as she understood that her little power play might have had consequences she hadn't anticipated. I placed the ring gently on the table next to Blake's plate without saying a word. The silence in the room was deafening as the reality of what I was doing sank in. Blake stared at the ring like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "What are you doing?" Blake finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked directly at him, seeing the confusion and growing panic in his eyes as he realized his perfect life was about to implode. But I didn't answer his question because honestly he should have known exactly what I was doing and why. Susan tried to intervene, saying, "Now, let's not be hasty about anything," but I held up my hand to stop her. I'd listened to enough of her opinions about my character and motivations to last several lifetimes. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted me out of her son's life, but apparently she hadn't expected it to happen quite so dramatically or immediately. I picked up my purse from the chair and walked toward the front door without looking back at any of them. Behind me, I could hear Blake's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up and started following me. "Wait," he called out, "we need to talk about this." "You're overreacting." Overreacting. That single word confirmed everything I needed to know about how Blake saw the situation. In his mind, his mother's systematic attack on my character was just normal family dynamics, and my refusal to tolerate it was an unreasonable emotional response. He still didn't understand that what had happened was fundamentally wrong. I reached the front door and turned the handle, feeling a rush of cold November air hit my face. Blake caught up to me in the entryway, looking panicked and confused. "Please don't leave like this," he said. "My mom didn't mean anything by what she said. She's just protective. We can work this out. She didn't mean anything by it." Even now, with our engagement officially over, Blake was still making excuses for his mother's behavior instead of acknowledging how cruel and inappropriate it had been. He was more concerned about smoothing things over than understanding why I was hurt. That told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage would have been like. I walked to my car without responding to his pleas for explanation or discussion. Blake followed me to the driveway, still talking about overreactions and misunderstandings while I unlocked my door. He kept saying we could fix this, that his family would apologize, that everything could go back to normal if I'd just calm down and be reasonable. But that was exactly the problem. Blake thought this was something that could be fixed with apologies and explanations, when really it was about fundamental respect and values. You can't fix someone who thinks it's acceptable for their mother to call their fiancé a gold digger. You can't reason with someone who laughs at insults directed at the person they claim to love. I got in my car and started the engine while Blake stood in the driveway looking bewildered. Through the windshield, I could see Susan watching from the front window, probably calculating whether she'd won or lost in this exchange. She'd gotten me out of Blake's life, but she'd also destroyed her son's engagement in the process. I wondered if she thought the trade-off was worth it. Blake knocked on my car window, begging me to roll it down so we could talk. But there was nothing left to say. I'd spent 2 years trying to prove I was worthy of his family's acceptance and 5 minutes discovering that no amount of proving would ever be enough. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the person you're fighting for doesn't think you deserve to win. I backed out of the driveway and drove away from that house knowing I'd never see any of them again. In my rearview mirror, I could see Blake standing in the street watching my car disappear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him because he genuinely seemed confused about what had just happened. But then I remembered his laugh when his mother called me a gold digger, and my sympathy evaporated completely. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had occurred, and surprisingly, I felt more relieved than heartbroken. I'd escaped a marriage that would have been built on his family's tolerance rather than genuine acceptance. I'd avoided years of holiday dinners where Susan would make subtle digs about my worthiness, while Blake pretended not to notice. Most importantly, I'd finally stood up for myself in a way that felt powerful and definitive. No arguments, no explanations, no attempts to justify my worth to people who'd already decided I didn't measure up. Just a simple action that communicated my standards more clearly than any speech could have. Blake called and texted dozens of times over the next few days, but I didn't respond. His messages ranged from angry accusations that I'd embarrassed him in front of his family to desperate pleas for another chance to confused demands for explanations. But I'd already given him the only explanation that mattered by placing that ring on his table and walking away. 3 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Blake was telling people I'd overreacted to harmless family teasing and that I'd thrown away a good relationship over nothing. The fact that he still didn't understand what had actually happened confirmed that I'd made exactly the right choice. Some people never learn that love without respect isn't really love at all. I kept the homemade dinner rolls, though. They turned out perfectly, and I wasn't about to let Susan's behavior ruin a good recipe. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let toxic people diminish the good things in your life and moving forward with your dignity intact.